and glad you could join us on the Nobody Asked Me Guy show. We're very happy to have you here with us. Some very exciting guests. You know, people like to talk about history, and we never get to have conversation with living history. Well, tonight, guess what? You are in for a treat. We have living history in the persons of Mrs. Elaine Eason-Steele, who's the co-founder of the Raymond and Rosa Parks Institute for Self-Development, and Mrs. Anita Peet, who is the executive director of the Raymond and Rosa Parks Institute for Self-Development. Back and relax, and Mrs. Peak and Mrs. Steele will be sharing with us, and feel free to ask any questions that you might have. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Melvin Lars. I am the host of the Nobody Asked Me Guy. I'm jack of all trades. I do a lot of different things. However, one of the most important things that's happening right now is that we're very fortunate to have two living icons with us. And I repeat myself by simply saying many times, we read about history, we read about people, and we never get to talk to those who are behind the scenes. We never get to talk to those who actually had the opportunity to sit at the feet of the individuals that we hear about and the individuals that we read about. So you're in for a treat, and we will introduce at this time Mrs. Elaine Steele. Mrs. Steele, good evening.
Good evening. It is indeed a pleasure to be with you. I wish I was with you in person, since it's about 9 degrees here with snow, and it is cold, cold, cold.
Yes, indeed. You know, I lived there 20 years in the Michigan and Ohio area, and let me tell you, I am not envious of you at all.
No, you're not.
I am not envious of you at all. I hope that you're enjoying this weather. Mrs. Peak, how are you this evening, dear?
I'm just finding you, and as always, we're glad that you reached out to us. Thank you.
Well, you know what, ladies, and I say to our listening audience, is that I am the one that's pleased that you accept it, because I have the utmost respect for Mrs. Peak and Mrs. Steele. These ladies are true icons. They've been out here battling for a long time with civil rights issues and just being great, great humanitarians. And I'm excited that they're here. Mrs. Peaks, if you will, if you just kind of share with us a little bit, you know, everybody loves to ask the question, how did you meet Rosa Parks? And everybody loves to ask that question, including myself. So if you don't mind just sharing with us a little bit, how did you actually meet Mrs. Parks?
Well, my story is not as exciting as Miss Steele, so let Miss Steele go first, because hers is the most exciting story.
Okay. Can you hold 1 second? Can you hold 1 second, please? Right. Maya, can you hear them? Great. Okay. Okay, go ahead, Mrs. Steele.
All right. I met Mrs. Parks as a student in high school. I was looking for an after-school job, and I got a job at the Stockton sewing factory. And the Stocktons were friends of Mrs. Parks when she was in Alabama. They had a sewing factory there. And when she moved to Detroit, Michigan, she indeed reconnected with them. So I was a sewing student. I was in dress design at Cass Technical High School, which was in walking distance from the sewing factory. And when I walked in and told them, that I was looking for a job, they asked me if I could sew, and I said, "Oh yes, I can sew." And they said, "Well, do you know how to use the power machine?" I said, "Oh yes, I know how to use the power machine." I didn't know a power machine from any other sewing machine. So they hired me on the spot, and my seatmate was Rosa Parks.
Wow.
To say that I was too excited was putting it mildly, because that was my first meeting of her, and I had only seen her on television, connected with the Montgomery bus boycott and all of the brave people who were there walking for freedom. So
Yes.
meeting Mrs. Parks was definitely a treat. She was so kind and, just so patient with me as she showed me how to use a power machine. I thought because I could use a domestic machine, which, went slowly and you could regulate the speed, that it would not be difficult to switch to a power machine.
Okay.
Not. It was quite difficult. And on my first item, we were making aprons, and my stitches just went all over the place because I didn't know the proper way to handle the machine. But Mrs. Park was so patient with me and assisted me in taking my stitches out and said, "Now, dear, this is the way you should do it." And so from that moment on, we became friends. I lasted there at the Stockton Sewing Factory all of about a week. And then it was a mutual decision between the employee that perhaps there was a better job for me.
I hear you.
At someplace else. So we parted company, and I didn't see Mrs. Parks again until after I had graduated from high school, and we were working in the federal building. At that time, she was working for Congressman John Conyers, and I worked for the federal district court. And one day we were leaving the building at the same time, and I said, "Oh, Miss Parks." And she said, "Oh, hi, Elaine. How are you?" And at that time, she was driving. So she said, "Where do you live? Can I drop you at the bus stop or drop you home?" And so I told her where I lived, and she said that I did not live far from her and that she could drop me home. And so the rest is history. After that, we became friends. I assisted her, she assisted me, and the rest is history.
Wow, that is powerful. Great. That
and
is
as
great.
I said, her story is much better than mine. I just met her because of Miss Steele, so that's my story.
Well, but you know what, Mrs. Peaks, that
my sister.
yes.
Audience.
Okay. Well, yeah. Listen, that is okay that you met her through Mrs. Steele. I have been blessed to have meet you and Mrs. Steele through Mitch, and I never would have met
my son-in-law.
Yes, and I never would have met either of you. So that's okay that you had someone that was close enough to introduce you. Maya is with us, and Bobby is with us. Sonia is with us. If you guys have any questions, just jump right in. You don't have to wait until you don't have to wait for me. If you have any questions for Mrs. Peak or Mrs. Steele, jump right in. And if not, we will move on with the interview and go a little further, and you may have some questions later. But I would like to, and Mrs. Peak has shared very succinctly about her meeting Mrs. Parks and about how she interacted and had the contact with her. Ms. Peak, if you don't mind, you and Ms. Steele, I really would like you to share with our audience, how did you become involved with the civil rights movement? I understand that Mrs. Parks was heavy into the movement, but as we all know, a lot of times we meet people, but we don't necessarily get involved in the process. So do you mind how either one or both of you got involved with the movement, or what maybe prompted you to get involved?
Okay, well, I was 6 years old in 1955.
Right.
The Montgomery bus boycott began, and our church, we went to St. John. At that time, it was CME Christian. It became Christian Methodist Episcopal, but it was really colored Methodist, Episcopal. That's how far we go back.
Okay.
And but it was always called St. John CME. I think it was 1957 that it became Christian Methodist. But anyway, we were charged with bringing clothes to church and donations, and the trustees and stewards of the church, the men, drove in station wagons down to Montgomery, and they kept a running tally and reporting of their visits to Montgomery and how the bus boycott was going. And as you know, it lasted more than a year.
Yes.
And so that was my first introduction, knowing that we had to make the necessary sacrifices. And in Detroit, because of the auto companies, most men worked in the factories, that they were involved with civil rights, because in the late 50s, there were a lot of layoffs. And so their ability to go, they had the freedom to go back south to help in the civil rights movement. You know, it was a good time. In 1960, when I graduated from elementary school, we were going to Augusta, Georgia. I was born in Augusta, Georgia.
Okay.
Miss Steele was born in Tuskegee, Alabama.
Okay.
But in Augusta, Georgia, we were on our way to Augusta, Georgia. That was where our mother lived. And we stopped in Cincinnati. And at that time, you know, as you know, the act was not passed until 1964.
Right.
And we stopped at Big Boys. We love Big Boys here in Detroit. And we stopped at Big Boys. And when we went in the store, it was the restaurant, everybody froze. It
Really?
was like, you know, these terrorists were coming in or something, I don't know. And anyway, I wanted to go out, but Miss Steele would not let me. And we ordered, and we sat down, and everybody that came in, they were, you know, gasping and pointing and all that, but she just made us sit right there. They finally, after they had plenty of discussion, I guess with the owners, I don't know if they called the police or not, but they finally gave us our order, and Miss Steele politely took mine and dumped them in the trash and walked out. And
Wow.
then the people went, oh, you know,
Wow.
yeah, so
Wow.
that was my next big memory of the civil rights movement. And when we got down to Georgia, they told us very clear, which we already knew, that, you know, we could not go to the movies. We could not go to go shopping and the like, because of once the boycott was over, Black people were determined that they would not shop anywhere that they were not treated equally. And so they were not going to put up with sitting in the balcony if you went to the movies, or having to put your foot out, and they drew your foot. Now you couldn't even take off your shoe.
Drew your foot?
Drew your foot, and then they would go pick out a pair of shoes. But if they didn't fit, you couldn't bring them back. So, you know, that kind of thing, if you had ever put them on.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, all that kind of ridiculous stuff that we lived through. And so they did not shop. And so that's what's going on at the time. We were down there. And segregation was something else. And now our schools, they were segregated but my mother went to Lucy Laney. Lucy Laney, who was very famous independent teacher. She was the Presbyterians played a strong role in education in the South, in particular in Augusta, Georgia. And she was 7 years old when she gained her freedom, and she spoke 7 different languages. And our mother was started school when she was 3, and
Wow.
so most of the children in Augusta, Georgia, and in the surrounding Carolina, South Carolina in particular, were very well educated.
Okay.
And Mary McLeod Bethune went to that school. Frank Yerby, there are a lot of famous names I could name that went to school as Lucy Laney was their teacher. So we were always raised and taught about segregation, civil rights, and our history as to how important education, that education equals freedom. And the story goes on and on. So Miss Steele can tell you in 1963, we were here in Detroit for the march. In Detroit, we weren't together. I was fortunate enough to shake Dr. King's hand. She was with Mrs. Park. She didn't get a chance to shake his hand. I wasn't with Mrs. Park. That's why I didn't get a chance to shake his hand. Okay. Well, I did shake his hand. He was so nice. He was very kind, very nice person, and treated you like he already knew you. I also was able to meet Malcolm X, and he was very nice, kind. A friend of ours was going to Highland Park Community College, and he came to the class and spent 2 or 3 hours talking and taking the time to answer everyone's question. So most of the civil rights leaders of the day really took time to educate us, and they were educators.
Wow.
Yes.
You know, as you and Mrs. Steele share that with us, Ms. Peak, thank you. Listen, I'm sitting here in awe. As you share that with us, I really hadn't planned to ask this question, but as you're sharing that, you may not want to answer this question, but how, with the state of today's education and education system, in your opinion, where do you think we went wrong? Because it certainly is not anywhere near what you've just explained.
Well, I think when we got complacent, we really thought that after the Voting Rights Act, and I think it was with us feeling that we could work anywhere, that we became, as they call it, middle class, because at one time Detroit had the largest number of homeowners in the United States.
Okay.
And we began to think, and then Coleman Young became the mayor of the city, and we thought that we had arrived. I think that's what happened. But then the political system slapped us back down to let us know that that wasn't the case. So emergency managers came into Michigan and came into Detroit, and our public school system here in Detroit, which probably was a hallmark for the rest of the country, went from number 5 in the nation down to the bottom. I think we're number 50 out of the 50 states now.
Wow.
And so that was the fact that they chose not to teach us. We had equal education at one time, no matter who you were, how poor you were. We all went to school. But today, there's so many reasons why children don't go to school, and when they do go, they're not learning. I never realized that you could graduate from high school in the United States and could not really read. We have teachers that are teaching that can't really read.
Yes.
So
yes.
We have just decided that because of the complexion of people's skin, that they are not going to put the funding or the effort into education that they once did, because they did it at one time, but it's not happening today.
Wow, you know what? That's a perfect segue into me asking Mrs. Steele, what prompted she and Mrs. Parks to start the Institute for Self-Development? I mean, I know it's kind of answers itself, but I know that it took some planning, took some conversation. Mrs. Steele, would you mind sharing with us why did you?
Oh, absolutely. When I graduated from high school, Mrs. Parks and I formed a bond, in that we both worked at the federal building in Detroit. That is the building now is called the U.S. Courts. I worked for the courts, but she worked for Congressman John Conyers, and she did so until her retirement. Well, we would ride home together, and it came about that I started traveling with her and meeting people all over the country with her, and they were, of course, everybody, loved Mrs. Parks,
Yeah.
and as we moved, throughout the country, I stated that we needed to have an institute or some type of educational system, that what I was experiencing, that others could experience it also. So that's how we started the Rosa and Raymond Parks Institute, and Rosa's name was first because ladies are first.
Yes.
And but she loved Raymond, her husband, dearly, and she always included him in whatever he was doing. Mr. Parks was a barber, and he learned barbering in Montgomery, Alabama. And if you read the book that Mrs. Parks wrote, Rosa Parks, My Story, you will, hear a little about their romance and how they married and lived happily ever after through challenges because of segregation.
Mm-hmm.
But nevertheless, they loved each other immensely, and supported each other's desires to excel in whatever area they wanted to be supported. Her traveling and going around the country and discussing the civil rights movement, and she encouraged him in his barbering and voting and all the other things that they were able to do together and apart, but to keep in touch with each other. But for your listeners who might be interested, Mrs. Parks wrote a book, Rosa Parks, My Story, and that was by Rosa Parks with Jim Haskins. And if you get the book, you will see a picture of Mrs. Parks sitting on the bus, and a newspaper reporter is sitting behind her, a white man. This was a picture that was taken at the time that the people who stayed off the buses for 361 days returned. 381 days, Ms. Peak is correcting me.
Okay.
That they returned to the buses, and they were showing that white people and black people could now occupy the same space or sit in the same area. Of course, they didn't call us black at that time. They called us Negroes.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, but Mrs. Parks and my history continued in that I began to travel with her when she was invited to speak at various events. And I just learned so much about her and her immediate family, which was she, her husband, and her mother. She did have a brother, and her brother was married and had a large family. But when her brother moved to Detroit because of segregation in the South and the segregation that he had received in the armed services, shortly after that, Mrs. Parks, Mr. Parks, and Mrs. McCauley, Mrs. Parks' mother, they moved to Detroit also. And of course, you heard the story earlier where I met her in the sewing factory.
Yes.
But after graduation, we met again when she was working for Congressman John Conyers, and they certainly had a beautiful working relationship and experience. And sometimes the congressman would tease her, and because she would say, "Oh, there's so many people that come to see you." He said, "Miss Parks, they're not coming to see me; they're coming to see you."
Okay.
We, and indeed, Mrs. Parks and I, she was like an adopted mother, and I was like an adopted daughter to her, and we had a very warm relationship throughout the remaining of her life.
That's cool. And again, guys, if you have any questions for Mrs. Steele and Mrs. Peak, they are open to your questions. So please feel free to jump in. You don't have to be shy.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. So I do have a question. This is Maya, and thank you again, Mr. Rhodes, for holding such a good podcast. But my question, Mrs. Steele and Mrs. Peak, relates to education. So I was just wondering what was the environment like at the time when Brown versus the Board of Education was passing?
Did you understand the question? I know my computer may have not.
I didn't understand those. I guess the last sentence or so.
Well, okay. She was saying Maya was saying as you talk about Brown versus the Board of Education, and Maya, would you mind repeating the last part of your question, please?
How was the environment like at the time
Yes.
of the passing?
She was wondering what the environment was like. I'm sorry.
In Detroit, we didn't realize how segregated a city Detroit was growing up. In fact, the first Black high school teacher was in Flint, Michigan, and that was I think it was somewhere around in the early 60s. And we did not realize because of our parents, nobody really talked about it that much. But because certain neighborhoods were mixed, other neighborhoods were not, but we didn't think about it as racial at that time. Same thing about the school. As we would go to the school, sometimes when we would start at the school might have been predominantly white, but by the time we finished, the schools were predominantly black. So we didn't realize, nobody talked about the fact that it was based on race. But in the early 70s was when busing became a big issue in Pontiac, Michigan, and all over the suburbs. And that was when we realized how race affected and how segregated the North was, when we'd always heard it was all in the South. But we found out that that was not true.
Excellent question, Maya. And please feel free to fire away. Any other questions you might want to ask, just fire right away. Anyone else? While we're waiting for more questions, I would like to pose this question, because it happens to all of us when we get involved in situations. And I was just wondering, were there any attempts made by your friends or your family members to discourage either of you from aligning yourselves with the civil rights movement? Even though we know Mrs. Parks was extremely popular, unfortunately, as with any movement, you have those individuals that, for lack of a better word, are afraid. And I know that there are a lot of adjectives and adverbs that can follow afraid, but I just, again, wonder if you had any relatives or friends, acquaintances trying to persuade you not to be involved.
Well, not from our family. We certainly did not, have that. And if Mrs. Parks had it from her family, she did not discuss it. Mrs. Parks was always a very private person and the epitome of a lady. And I know that there appeared to be members of her family that were not excited about the stance that she had taken, but they knew better than to say anything. Her brother and she were very close because it was just the two offspring, and her mother was ill when they moved to Detroit, and he would come over and assist her with their mother, whenever he could. They had a family of 13, and so he could not come as often as he would have liked to, but he grew their food at home and taught the children how to, grow their food also. But he always would come and, check on his mother and his sister.
Wow. Well, that's great to hear that members tried to stand in the way, because, again, and I don't want to repeat myself, but I just have been in too many situations where I see family members try to dissuade other individuals from taking a stance against injustices, and saying, well, just leave it alone, and that's somebody else will take care of it, etc. And I think the time that we've all known each other is that one thing and I'll speak to myself, I am not one of those persons that sit back and wait for somebody else to make the change. And it's
not
great.
At all, not at all.
No, ma'am.
Well, you have to remember, with us growing up at the time we did, coming from the South, the church was where, in the South in particular, that was the foundation. That was where we were educated. As I said, my mother went to a Presbyterian school from the 3rd grade to the 12th grade. In most of the South, there were no high schools available for children of color. So if you had to stop school at the 5th grade, if you were a girl, and if you were a boy, 3rd grade. It only went to public school. Well, I have to be honest with you, today is not much different, because if you are not reading past the 3rd or the 5th grade, even though you graduate from high school, it's about the same thing.
Yes.
So, but then the opportunities to be educated, it was such an important part of our life that the church supported you going on to high school, to going on to college. They raised the funds, even though our jobs weren't even minimum wage in a lot of cases. We still always had enough to make sure people were able to be educated. And of course, you know, HBCUs, that was where we went. Our mother graduated from Melvin.
Okay.
That was a HBCU,
yes.
You know, and she went to. She didn't get a chance to go home very often.
Okay.
Because and she lived in Augusta, and as you know, Spelman is in Atlanta.
Yes.
But,
yes.
But the main thing was the education.
Mm-hmm.
That was how important it was. And her, she wanted to be a medical doctor, but you know, financially that didn't happen. But she was a very intelligent woman. She was a teacher. Her sister was a teacher, and they did what they could to make sure that we were all well educated. That was very important then. Now, we don't think about it as much as we need to, but I think that because the educational system in the United States is in such dismal shape, I think people are going to start thinking again about how important literacy is and start working on that.
I would certainly hope so. Maya was asking how and I was Maya. Excellent question. Maya is wanting to know if you can share with her, or even if either of you know, how did they determine who would get to go to the 3rd, or the boy get to go to the 3rd, girl to the 5th. She was wondering if there was a system that would explain how that worked, or if that was just something that came about. So I'll be quiet and allow you to answer.
Okay, it was because of slavery. They were afraid of the black man.
Okay.
It's always been the issue in the United States. They were always afraid that if the black man became too educated, he would take the jobs away from whites, because a lot of poor whites couldn't get jobs because of slavery, because the skilled trades were black people because they were the slaves. So when they paid them nothing. So when slavery was over, then even today, it's very difficult. You'll see it's a very disproportionate number of whites in skilled trades than there are blacks. But we are the ones who created the skilled trades, because we were the skilled people.
Mm-hmm.
We literally built this country. Mm-hmm. And so to keep black men from being educated has always been the issue. And girls, they felt if they got to the 5th grade, they could just help more in the house, in the home. But it was all about us, the black men being in the field, doing the manual labor, and therefore they didn't need that much education. All they needed to know it was how to sign their name, put an X, and that was all about racism. That education is power, and we were to be powerless. And that's the plain reason.
Wow.
And as you can see, look at the situation we're in today. We had one of the greatest presidents in President Obama, one of the smartest and the greatest presidents of the United States, and look who's the president right now. And that was all it was to show that that any white person was better. That this is Anita's opinion. That any white person was better than a black man being the president, because they got very afraid. If we can get to be the president, my God, what's going to happen? That's what that wall is all about, keeping out people of color. But, I get carried away. But
that's okay.
Anyway,
no. We want to hear from you. Maya asked a question, and she wanted an answer to her question.
Are there any questions?
Yes. Maya is asking another question.
Yeah. Well, no, it was only to also just it's interesting. That's that rationale. It's very interesting, because I would think that at least nowadays it's changing, thankfully. But I think the emphasis is on girls not getting the education, even at the time when my parents were growing up. Maybe there was that rationale again of the girls not getting that education and just staying at home. So just based on the rationale that happened during the civil rights movement, I thought it was interesting to wonder about that discrepancy that happened.
Yes.
You can look at the statistics, and you can see the percentage. It has to do with the percentage of black people and where they're located. And it's clear. One time, there were more black men in college than in any other place. Now, my understanding is it's not more, it's close to as many in prison as there are in college.
Yes.
And my understanding is that there are more black women today in college than black men. And that is by design. Nothing happens by accident. I don't believe.
Listen, no. I'm glad you're sharing that. And I just want to say, as far as Maya, and Maya, I hope you don't mind me saying that. Unfortunately, since there are some camera issues, and we can't see the faces of Mrs. Peak and Mrs. Steele, and they can't see your face, Maya. Maya is what America would call a minority herself. She's not of African American descent. And I don't know, Maya, if you'd like to share or not, but I mean, not that should make any difference, but I'm just sharing. I want to share with Mrs. Peak and Mrs. Steele, since they can't see you physically, the questions that you're asking. And as you're saying, when you're asking about the disparity, because unfortunately, there are other areas where men seem to think still to this day that women don't need much education, and that people of a certain financial background, etc., do not need a whole lot of education. So I just, since Mrs. Steele and Ms. Peak could not see that you are that your ethnicity is different, I just wanted to just give them an insight so that we could all be on the same page.
Thank you for doing so.
Oh, you're more than welcome. Now, I would like to ask the ladies, because I know they've been involved quite heavily in the civil rights movement. And have either of you ever received any hate mail or threats of receiving bodily harm? I know, when we watch movies and you watch stuff on TV, we always see things like that occurring with persons that decide to make a stand be they background persons or be they persons in the light? Have you had the unfortunate situation of receiving negative mail or people threatening you bodily?
Well, that came to me as a Teamster. I was in the Teamsters union for 23 years. I mean, 27 years. I worked at Marathon Refinery in Southwest Detroit as a chemist for 23 years. But I was a trustee, then I was a business agent, and I was secretary treasurer of our local. And I want to tell you, it was quite interesting. And at the refinery, when I left there in 1996, and there was still maybe at the most 50 people of color at that time, and out of 325 people, and maybe a dozen women. And the fact that, and when we went to Washington to protest, and this is 1980, when Ronald Reagan, President Reagan at that time, he fired all the air traffic controllers. If you remember, he broke.
Oh yes, I remember.
Traffic controller union.
I remember.
He went to Washington with other unions. They put dogs and hoses and everything else on us at that time. Now, I wasn't a kid anymore, but this was the early 80s.
Yes. In
the United States. Okay, so you can imagine what it was like back in the late 50s and the 60s. But this was the early 80s.
Oh, yeah. Wow. Wow. You know, wow. Wow. You can't see my face, but it's like, wow. That, you know, because when I hear that, Ms. P, and again, with all of the lies and myths that are out there, and as Maya is asking her question, she's excited as well. You know, is that how people try to paint a false perception of other people so that they can remain in power and continue their power and that kind of craziness. But wow, that was just a very interesting take. What advice would either of you give, both of you actually, give the young people about perseverance and continued pursuits of their positive destinies?
Well, I think they have to step out. And I think that technology is, of course, very important. And I wish that I knew it better. And I'm looking for my 7-year-old grandson to help me. But,
that's okay.
But they need to read. They need to read and understand their history. Is the theme for Pathways is where have we been and where are we going? If you don't know where you've been, you don't know where you're going.
Yes.
And I think that that's very important, that it was the young people. If you've seen the film, The Children's March, it was the children that were willing to step out when the adults were afraid. And that's what we have to do, again, is look to the young people to step up. And this media frenzy that we've had for, I guess, about the last 30 years of degrading women in particular, but men too, and this horrific music. Whereas when we were growing up, the music was uplifting. It made you want to work harder. You know, James Brown, I'm Black and I'm Proud. You know, those kinds of things were the kind of music that we came up on.
Right.
We need to get back to a lot of that. I know that some young people are, and it takes time. Just like it took time for it to get like this, it took time for it'll take time to get back. But people got complacent. They thought that they had it made in the shade and they didn't have to work as hard as they once did. But today we have to work even harder.
Absolutely.
And another thing that the young people can do is to join our program, Pathways to Freedom. That it's a historical and educational program where we, in fact, go through Mrs. Park's books. We go around our state and our country when economics supports us. But it's important that we understand what's going on in various parts of our country as well as the world. We had an opportunity that some of the students were able to go to Africa.
Yes.
Then we have had students that have come from all over the world too to be a part of Pathways to Freedom.
Yes.
So I invite you that if you are interested in learning more about what you heard today and participating in any way with our program, to join our Pathways to Freedom program through the Rosa and Raymond Parks Institute for Self-Development.
Excellent. And Mrs. Peak and Mrs. Steele, while I have you here, while we're speaking of the Institute, once we work the bugs out on the camera, I would love for you and Ms. Peak to come back, Ms. Steele, and talk specifically about the Institute. So once we're able to work the bugs out and get the camera going, I'll be in contact, and if you and Ms. Peak will let me know when you're ready to roll, then I'll advertise it and get it ready, and then we'll come back and again we'll broadcast it on YouTube and also on Periscope and on Facebook and on Mixler and this station here to Get Vocal. So that'll be a lot of outlets that we can talk about Pathways to Freedom. So I just want you.
That sounds wonderful and something that we'll be interested in, and also those mediums that you just mentioned. Hopefully, somebody can help us in using them. Yeah, we're going to go to school. 2019, we're going to school.
Well, all right then. All right. All right then. All right.
We need the youth to teach us. That's right.
Well, you know what? The youth had to teach me, so I would not sit here and pretend like I just had it all together. I had to talk to some young people, and all the while they were laughing, but they still got me going.
All right.
Okay. Do we have any more questions from our audience? But Mrs. Peak, I would like to, Mrs. Steele, I would like to ask you, and on the question that I put down there, in your opinion, I think I know the answer, but I would like you to share with us as we close this out. In your opinion, if Mrs. Parks was alive today, do you feel that she would still be fighting current civil rights issues?
Yes. That not in the same way.
Yes.
That was done earlier, but there is still a lot of unrest. They are closing down jobs that were once held by laborers and not doing anything to replace them. Teaching people new skills. So, that we indeed have to stay current and to look for, helping our brothers and sisters of all colors. There is still a lot of work to be done. At the time when the factories were at their height, most people owned their own homes, and Detroit in particular and many other areas in the country were thriving metropolis. But now you look at Detroit, there are abandoned houses, there are houses that have been razed, and they are looking forward to moving people of color out and replacing them with others. So we have to always stay current, always stay vigilant, and to understand that education is important.
Absolutely. Well, Mrs. Peaks and Mrs. Steele, I thank you for sharing with us. As always, both of you ladies have done a fantastic, fantastic job. You can't see Maya, but she's nodding her head, and we had some other people sharing with us as well. And we just want to say we thank you very much. And I do want you to keep in the forefront that as soon as we get the camera bugs out, that we come back and talk about pathways to freedom, and you can have a whole hour or however you need to share about the program and how people can get involved, how they can donate. So I'm going to ask you right now, if you share with our audience how they may contact the Institute, how they can donate and share.
Well, thank you, and we look forward to coming back. And they can go to www.rosaparks.org, and we have to our website, and we have PayPal account, and I think we have I'm pretty sure we have a GoFundMe page also, where they can donate. But we're as you say, every year we have to get a few more young people on board to help us get 21st century side. So I know that we have these things, but I will be talking to them to make sure everything's working correctly.
Absolutely, and
thank you.
No, thank you. And
we have to keep the institute growing and prospering. Yes,
absolutely. Because as we close this segment, again, I want to thank all of our guests, and I want to thank those that joined us. But I just want to share as we close this segment is that what Mrs. Peak and Mrs. Steele is sharing with us is that we have to help our kids understand legacy and positive legacy.
Yes.
And unfortunately, we do not teach legacy, positive legacy. Our kids are inundated with false narratives from other people, and that's just a horrible thing. People across the world, and as Maya was sharing, as we know in a lot of countries, etc., they don't want the girls to be educated and all of this kind of craziness, and even though they are just like you've shared, Mrs. Steele, Mrs. Mrs. Peak, being a chemist, I can barely spell chemist, and you are a chemist by profession, and you talked about how smart your mother is, and I know how smart you and Mrs. Steele are because I've been around you for years, and I just enjoy your professionalism and all that you bring, because I will speak for Melvin Lars. I respect legacy. I love to see legacy go forward, and I'm going to do all that I can while I can to help keep legacy moving forward. And that certainly includes the Rosa. Thank you for correcting me, Mrs. Steele. The Rosa and yes, ma'am.
Ladies first.
Absolutely, always.
And I would also, we were neglectful in not mentioning our father. Our father was a Tuskegee Airman.
Wow.
Very brilliant man. When he came here in Detroit, after he left the military, he was engineering job at Ford Motor Company until he showed up to work.
Huh.
And they told him they just couldn't, because they didn't know he was a black man. They thought he was foreign, and therefore they could not. They'd have to put him on the line. They could not hire him as an engineer.
Wow.
He always owned his own business, and he took us out to City Airport to show us so that we could see how the planes operated and that he could fly. They told him that he could only be a co-pilot.
Wow.
He could not fly the plane.
Wow.
This is after World War II. So we got lots of stories to tell.
And you know what? That's why I hope you and Mrs. Steele comes back, because I mean, just everybody. I don't care what quote race you are, what color you are. Everybody know about the Tuskegee Airmen. That's yes, me. Everybody, and it's just fabulous. That I'm so glad that you shared that. That your dad was a Tuskegee Airman, and because that's another story in itself.
Yes, it is, and that's how I came to be born in Tuskegee.
Okay.
My father was a Tuskegee Airman.
Okay, that's something to be sure. Listen, I'm fired up and excited about our next talk. As a matter of fact, we have a gentleman from Louisiana, in Arcadia, Louisiana, named Mr. Billy Graham. He was not a Tuskegee Airman, but he was one of the first African American pilots out of Louisiana, and he's going. Yes, he is going to be on with us. Mr. Billy Graham is going to be on with us on the 8th of February, and he's.
So you have to show. We have to know before the 8th of February how to get on.
Yes, get those young people. Get those young people to
those brilliant students that
absolutely.
With you,
Absolutely.
To, give us a tutorial.
Yeah, because you know what, that now, if I say so myself, that would be a coup. You have a gentleman that was flying in the Vietnam War that's African American. You are daughters of a Tuskegee Air person, and as I said, we have 4 screens, and I would just be beside myself to have Mr. Billy Graham and the two of you all on this screen talking. Wow, I'm getting excited just talking about it.
Well, we would love to be involved in such a training.
Fantastic.
We need it.
Fantastic. I certainly want you to stay in tune with us, because we have I've been blessed. I have a great lineup coming up. Donnie Little. Most people are familiar with the University of Texas, and if you, especially those of us that are past 25, with the Texas Longhorns and people altitude in Texas even now. And he was a trailblazer. He was the first African American quarterback that played and started at that university. And I had the pleasure of coaching this young man when I was a young man as a coach myself.
Yeah.
And
that's right, because you are a former football player.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
And he's going to be with us as well. So I'm fired up about that. And I mean, we've just been very blessed to have a whole array of individuals that are moving forward. And Sharissa Monroe, you heard that name before? Miles Monroe's daughter? The late Reverend. The late Reverend Miles Monroe.
Oh, yes.
His daughter, Sharissa, is going to be with us as well.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. So we are very blessed to have individuals like yourselves, and I'm telling you, we still have some of our listeners on. I'm glad they're still here. And for those that may not know, I'm telling them, Mrs. Peak and Mrs. Steele are 2 ladies to know. I mean, they are icons. They work very hard. They're very dedicated. They're very diligent at what they do. And I have the utmost respect for them. And my friend Claude, how is he? And
he's coming along. He's coming along. Thank you for asking.
Fantastic. And the Institute. So with that, we'll be closing out. I'd just like to share with them how they can contact me. I am the Nobody Asked Me guy. And one day we will tell you why we decided to name the show the Nobody Asked Me guy. But I can be contacted at www.dyingonmyfeet.com. Now, once you get to that website, then you will find all of my other social media sites there, and you can hit any of those buttons, and you can contact me via Periscope. You can contact me via LinkedIn, YouTube, the whole plethora. So we want to make sure that you have various ways of contacting us. And again, if you would join us next week, we will be excited and happy to see you. And we are going to have one of our own. Dr. Vibe is an award-winning podcaster. He just got an award about 3 weeks ago, and we are putting Dr. Vibe on the hot seat. He's held over 2,000 of these, and he's won several awards. But he's going to be the person that's going to be answering questions next week. So if you're so inclined, please come back and join us, and we'll be more than happy to sit down again and share with you. So we wish you peace and happiness, and we thank you very much for being here with us. And with that, we will bid you good night from the Nobody Asked Me guy. Be blessed and take care.
Thank you. It was a pleasure and an honor. Thank you, and good night.
Good night.